Symbolising Japan's post-war recovery, the World Exposition in 1970 ignited the imagination of ordinary people. Right in the middle of the Cold War, the exhibition sought to bring people together from all over to the end of mutual acceptance and the advancement of human civilization. I love to cover these World Expo events because I think they tell us a lot of interesting information about what was going on at the time. In previous episodes, I've covered the architectural progress of the City Beautiful movement, which found its debut at the Columbia World Exposition in 1893, and how the ruling elite used the London World Exhibition in 1851 to persuade the world to let it colonise it. The World Expo of 1970, officially known as Expo 70, was held in Osaka, Japan. The event was a landmark in world exhibitions with over 75 pavilions, showing off technological advancements like computers and the mobile phone, and the footage of the event is to die for, and I'll have it playing in the background for much of this video. The event has been studied by historians from all over the world, being right in the middle of the Cold War, demonstrating the ideological arm wrestle between the US and the Soviet Union, with both flexing its achievements in the space race. The US by bringing parts of the moon down to Earth, and with the Soviets honouring the centennial birth of Lenin and the Soviets bringing their Soyuz spaceships. It was an important event for Japan too, who consistently participated in world expositions to define and redefine its national identity. It was described as a Japanese event for Japanese people, with 62 of the 64 million visitors being Japanese. Today we're covering the story of the exhibition's biggest attraction. America's literal moon rock attracted people in their millions to the exhibition. It's a fascinating story of how this little rock from the moon was a tool of propaganda from the US, who was desperate to improve its reputation in global public opinion, especially in Asia following its involvement in the Vietnam War, its Cold War with Russia, and its bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan during the Second World War. What started on a pedestal of cultural fascination ended leaving a bitter taste in the mouth of many exhibition attendees, and what promised to further America's reputation as the pinnacle of developmentalism, with all its feats of science and engineering, in reality led to vast criticism over American frivolity and its public spending and misplaced values of racing to space rather than taking care of home soil. Today, I am leaning very heavily on this paper, the 1970 Osaka World Exhibition and the Limits of US Science Diplomacy in the Space Age by Teasel Muir Harmony, who explains the story so beautifully and has so many brilliant quotes I just couldn't leave out, so I'll link it in the notes if you want to read it yourself, and let's get into the episode. Osaka's Expo in 1970 was based on the theme of the progress and harmony for mankind. It was not only about the search for Japan's future, but has a broader significance in the history of civilization. It was originally to be hosted by Japan in 1940 to celebrate the 2600th anniversary of the accession of the first Emperor Jimmu to the throne, but as World War II escalated, it was cancelled. But the exhibition in 1970 turned out to be an incredible success, bringing together 77 states with over 64 million people in attendance between March and September, making it one of the most attended world fairs in history. At a time of increasing economic prosperity in Japan, it came with a hefty price tag, costing over 5 times that of the Tokyo Olympics, but it also came with 110 kilometers of new roads, and 650 billion yen invested in new roads and railways alone. It was situated on the hills of the northern outskirts of Osaka, where bamboo thickets were cleared. The exposition site was designed to play a role in a testing ground of ambitious social experiments. On an average day, 600,000 people would come and visit 118 pavilions. The vast majority were Japanese, providing a ripe context for showcasing America's space sector. Now, this event happened right in the middle of the Cold War, which went from 1947 to 1991. It saw the ideological arm wrestling and much flexing of muscles between the US and the Soviet Union. Japan had remained isolationist, refraining from dealing with international affairs and wishing to further Japan's economic prosperity. One of the cornerstone moments was the idea of technological advancement. Getting a man on the moon was a preoccupation of both countries. the Russians launching the first satellite Sputnik in October 1957, and the US retaliating by sending a man to the moon. This was to become a key part of the US's exhibition. When astronauts Charles Conrad and Alan Bean found a large rock near the northern rim of the moon's head crater, they did not predict that this humble scientific specimen would soon appear in the front page of all major Japanese newspapers, that millions of people would wait hours to see it in person, or that it would play a role in US-Japanese relations. 12055, as the moon rock was later designated, is roughly the size and shape of an eggplant. It was unmooned 15 million years prior by asteroid impact, and to the untrained eye, it appears to be identical to rocks found on Earth. But this was a 3.2 billion year old basaltic rock, displayed like a precious jewel, resting on metal prongs in a well-lit glass case. From March to September, 12055 captured the attention of Japanese Prime Minister Sato Isuku, the international press, and over 80 million Expo 70 attendees. The exhibition was part of a broader approach to American diplomacy in this period, where science and technology, or in this case, specimen 012055, were deployed as a tool of narrative to spread Western democratic values, win over international public opinion, and counter anti-American sentiment. Being barely distinguishable from an Earth rock, the exhibition prompted broader discussion in Japan about the applicability of American cultural norms to Japan's vision of modernity. The Cold War had been a dramatic space-age novella of the US and the USSR, competing for international clout and geopolitical advantage through galactic exploration. The Soviet Union fired first, launching the first artificial satellite in 1957, with the US firing back with the Apollo project. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the US and the USSR used their technological and scientific power to influence and sabotage the research programs of other nations, building ties across the world with scientific exchanges and education, and inundating the world with science-themed propaganda. Item 12055 was a material form of American victory, according to Susan Lindee, and became a symbol of soft power, incarnating an American-style modernity. It takes on multiple meanings: an object of science, a tool of diplomacy, and a national symbol for science, as well as US-Japanese relations. Or so it was thought. The role of science and technology in American foreign policy, particularly in the Cold War, is quite a niche point of interest. We know well the impact of American performing arts, how paintings, dance, and music made their way to audiences around the world, initiating waves of cultural revolution that caught on in the West and other places, and how the Soviet Union tried to shut them out, closing the eyes and ears of their population to the sounds of Pink Floyd, the Sex Pistols, and Iron Maiden, which were banned, amongst many other things, for promoting violence, religious obscurantism, and anti-Soviet propaganda. Although it's not reflected in the history of foreign relations literature, science and technology was widely celebrated as essential to American culture and society. It was not only viewed as the arms of economic growth, military power, and prestige, but was baked in as a method of spreading the democratic values of the West to win public opinion and stamp out any anti-American sentiment. Politicians, including President Nixon, were keen to distract the Asia region from the US's involvement in Vietnam, its military presence in Okinawa, and other problematic trade negotiations. Along with quite a lot of the world, there was a high level of interest in spaceflight in Japan in 1970, and so that the hope was that this lump of basalt would woo and impress the millions of attendees to the Japan Expo. Expo 70 marked the economic and social transformation of Japan. As one Japanese Expo attendee recalled, it was probably the first time that it began to feel like it wasn't the period after the war anymore. The Japanese economy was growing at a rate of between 10 and 15% per year. The US, on the other hand, which was once touted as the model of modernization, was entering a period of economic and cultural decline. As Japan became the third largest economy in the world, the US economy was ending a 20-year stretch of sustained prosperity. This shift in the balance of power called into question the American style of government and its role in global leadership. It's important to remember that American science had an impact on Japan during the Second World War. that was, for lack of a better word, nuclear. In August 1945, 2 atomic bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, killing around 220,000 people, with many more succumbing to radiation poisoning in the years to come. It marked the beginning of the end of the Second World War and a sinister new chapter in the nuclear arms race. An article published by Asahi Shimbun less than a week after the emperor announced that Japan would surrender succinctly explained the defeat. We lost to the enemy's science. Not only scientific research, but scientific reason and rationalization seemed to hold the answer to the war's loss, as well as a key for the prosperous future of Japan. After the war ended, the US looked to Japan to provide some economic and political stability in the region, which had become susceptible to communism, and to the US, the answer was through revitalizing science and engineering. In Japan, the ideology of developmentalism had its roots in the 1930s, but it was not until this post-war period that science, technology, and economic prosperity were equated. From here, the government made promoting science a priority at an unprecedented level and redirected military funds to research projects. The US sent over scientists and engineers, cementing its influence in Japan and the wider Pacific region. Through radio, motion pictures, the press, and publications, the US combated communism in the region. President Eisenhower went on a global mission to alleviate the fear of anything atomic and to sway public opinion towards nuclear power in Japan, wanting to encourage the Japanese people from their quote-unquote nuclear allergy, which is a disgusting way to describe it, bearing in mind the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The US wanted to explain nuclear physics to Japan, showing models of nuclear reactors and nuclear fission. The Atoms for Peace program gained a generally good reception. The Japanese media described nuclear energy as the most modern of technology, which will open the way for a new industrial revolution and supply limitless possibilities for mankind. Exhibits, films, and events led by both the US and the Soviet Union took on a space theme from 1957. Shortly after, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel into space in April 1961, the Soviet Union sent him on an international goodwill tour, which included a stop in Japan. The US responded a year later, sending a space capsule, Friendship 7, on a worldwide tour, which attracted a crowd of exceptional size, even by Tokyo standards, of 500,000 people to a large department store in the city. In May 1963, astronaut John Glenn visited Japan after serving as a voice communicator between Gordon Cooper on board of Faith 7. American ambassador to Japan, Edwin Reischauer, observed that Glenn and his family were an effective demonstration of American virtues. He believed that many seemed to, for the first time, appreciate the openness of the US space program compared to the Russian program. An Associated Press article noted that there was one marked contrast between Glenn's visit and that of Yuri Gagarin was kept under close wraps, and Glenn travelled casually. Glenn was accessible to almost anyone who wanted to ask him a question. Whilst Gagarin wore a military uniform, Glenn dressed in civilian suit and bow tie. Gagarin's actions and speeches gave the impression that he was under some restrictions, whereas everything that Glenn did was openly candid. President Kennedy himself was briefed on Glenn's fine contribution to the US-Japanese relations, which indicates that the political ramifications of the visit were ample and deemed significant, even at the highest level of American politics. Shortly before the first lunar landing in 1969, Glenn had written to President Nixon explaining the intense interest in our space program I experienced that was not abated, but has even increased in Japan through the years. The Japanese follow our program as if it was their own. And they did indeed. The response to the first lunar landing in Japan was tremendously enthusiastic. Nearly 1 million people in Japan alone visited the 36 Apollo exhibits, with 90% of the population watching the television coverage of the mission, and 120 out of the 800 press delegates on Cape Canaveral being from Japan on the day of the launch. Prime Minister Sato himself congratulated the United States. It was an epochal event in the history of mankind, made possible by the highly developed scientific and engineering technology of the US, courage and creativity. Thought to be a very effective antidote to the current criticism of the US, we can see why the White House agreed to send their Apollo astronauts to Japan in 1970. These criticisms were not insignificant. Protests erupted in 1970 against the revision of the US-Japan Security Treaty, with the US insistent upon maintaining their military bases in Japan, but for Japan to pay for the defense costs. The US agreed to return Okinawa to Japan, to remove nuclear material, and to keep combat bases on the island for military operations in South Korea, Taiwan, and Vietnam. Posted in the days before the Prime Minister took off for the Okinawa negotiations, the moon rocks were clearly an influential political commodity capable of swaying foreign outcomes, with a private showing at the Imperial Palace and the National Science Museum arranged. American Ambassador for Japan, Alexis Johnson, put it was absolutely essential to put our best foot forward at Expo 70, not only because it was the first World Fair in the Far East, but also because there was so much on stake here as our image as we entered the decade of the 70s. The US undertook extensive market research, finding that space research was the overwhelming first choice. By attempting to win the hearts and minds of the Japanese public and politicians through a moonrock display, US governments were using carrots instead of sticks to steer US-Japanese relations and maintain military and economic alliance. Visitors in front of the moonrock without fail gasped in surprise. The rock itself was not much, a black lump a little larger than a fist, but it came from the moon that brightens the roads at night from way out at space, the moon that existed only in the world of fairy tales. There was much media attention about the moon rock, but equally much disappointment. I was so disappointed. We saw it about 2 times, but the first time we saw it, we were so shocked. And we said to ourselves, this is the moon rock. It wasn't any different to stones here on Earth, said one housewife. The disappointing sentiment expressed in Japan about the value of the moon rocks was captured by Niigata-based artist Horikawa Michio in his Mail Art by Sending Stones project. In a title that referenced the local time in Japan when Armstrong first stepped on the moon, Horikawa explained, "I'm not interested in rocks on the moon. Let us have a thought that would transcend this event." He urged introspection and heightened sense of the physical existence of humankind. Humans are made out of chemical elements, like the moon rocks, but what sets them apart, Horikawa pointed out, is emotion and passion. Horikawa continued collecting stones from the riverbed for each new lunar mission. In December 1969, he sent President Nixon a black stone as a Christmas present, intended to convey 3 meanings. First, that Nixon should be focusing on Earth-based problems instead of the moon. Second, the colour of the stone referenced the death of the Vietnam War, as well as US race problems. And lastly, a symbolic protest akin to stone throwing. The American embassy in Tokyo expressed Nixon's great appreciation for your thoughtfulness in sending him the most unusual Christmas gift in an official thank you letter, asserting that Earth rocks were just as important as moon rocks, and gathering Earth rocks was equally important to gathering moon rocks. Muir's paper put it so well. Basalt lump 12055 posed so many questions about the application of science and technology, like why spend billions of dollars to retrieve a rock that is indistinguishable from Earth rocks? What is the value of 12055? What does it mean for a nation to invest in an Apollo-like program? What types of scientific and technological programs should a society pursue? For many, the moon rock illustrated the US's squandering of economic resources, arousing skepticism of cultural priorities and norms. The moon rock may have been the most popular exhibit in Expo 70, but popularity was not love or even high cultural regard. It graced the front pages of newspapers, prompted long lines and captivated millions of people, but the moon rock disappointed more than it awed. Horikawa echoed many Expo attendees' responses to the American moon rock in a message affixed to the Earth's bone. He sent to Nixon, "Nothing changes in the universe if humanity stood on the moon and brought back stones." Instead of looking across the Pacific, the emerging economic powerhouse then looked inward, finding independent technology and information exchange better aligned with Japanese visions for the future. And that is it, my friends. I hope you enjoyed today's story. I'd just like to hugely shout out Teasel Murahamani's paper, The Osaka World Exhibition and the Limits of US Science Diplomacy in the Space Age, which has all but completely informed today's episode. I've pretty much read this paper back to you, but if you would like to check it out yourself, I will leave a link in the notes. But yeah, the story was literally at the confluence of Cold War politics, space age exploration, and the US's international exploits in Asia. And I really hope you enjoyed this story. Please, if you liked it, give it a like, subscribe for more. I bring out videos every Tuesday. Monday, so ding that notification bell and I will see you next time.